After my conversation on Twitter, I came back with one question. And let's welcome Chloe Swarbrick to the show. Kia ora, Chloe. Welcome.
Kia ora.
Because I'm going to ask you the question, which was my summary of lots of fighting and having fun on it today. Chewie, you know the insult you use to people when you want to get. I used it to someone today. I won't say it on here, but I'll show you. You'll be proud of me with my insults. It was a fun time. This was my end up, and I'll ask you. This is my first question to you, Chloe. Welcome to the show. So lovely to have you on.
Thanks for having me.
Speaking of HYEFU and the result today, this is my question. It says, so here's the question, Munters. Don't care about whataboutisms aimed at Labor, because they'll go, but what about the last guys? If Willis, Luxon and the rest were not choosing to take $17 billion less based on their tax cuts and landlord benefits, would today's HYEFU been as bad? That was my question to Twitter. And then I said, come on, be honest. That was a fun question. But what are your thoughts?
Honestly, no, it would not have been as bad. What we have represented in HYEFU, this is my copy with all of my little post-its in there, and the updated the budget policy statement also, is that the government has self-inflicted an even deeper and worse recession, which has been brought about by the intentional choices that it has made to knowingly increase inequality, to lay people off, but also to punch down on beneficiaries. So, we're in a pretty sorry state of affairs, but I think it's really important for everybody to know that that's not inevitable. That is the consequence of current political choices. The double down on the tax system that IRD told us last year is actually profoundly unequal. That IRD research commissioned by David Parker, when he was Minister for Revenue, told us that the top 311 households in this country hold more wealth combined than the bottom 2.5 million New Zealanders, which is not an accident, but a consequence of a tax system which successive governments have nursed, which sees those at the top pay an effective tax rate less than half of that of the average New Zealander. And as you rightfully point out, Pat, those decisions made in the May budget for trickle-down tax cuts, which, I don't know if many people are really feeling them in their back pocket at this point in time, this far on, especially with the increases to costs for, early childhood, for public transport, for their prescription fees, and then the decaying infrastructure around us. Christopher Luxon told us that he'd been making all these hard choices, and what I see is that he was quite comfortable allowing for, capital gains for landlords at the expense of the infrastructure that everybody else relies on.
We're going to bring Craig Rennie on, and because we love being the dumbest people in the room, and we do it so well, and he'll educate us all about HYEFU, which does sound like an 80s kung fu movie to me. For some reason, it's got that vibe about it. Wouldn't be an appropriate kung fu movie today.
Is that what it is? Yeah.
It would be racially insensitive to have that as a kung fu movie today, but in the 80s, that could have been an 80s kung fu movie. Very good, Sarah. Hey, you easily fucked up. Hey, Willis. As a nutshell, though, we're not going to get into surplus for longer. The books are looking worse, and I just. When I heard or saw on the news that they were $13 billion out from what they thought, and then I realized there was $14 billion worth of tax cuts, it's one of those, if you don't laugh, you're going to cry. I did audibly laugh because, and I think I did a tweet something that said something like, who's going to tell her? They're $13 billion short. There's $14 billion in tax cuts. Who's going to tell her? And people on my Twitter, people going, I will. But isn't it just as simple as that?
Look, so getting Craig on is going to be really useful to actually unpack this in ways that make sense to regular people, because he's very, very skilled in this.
Yeah.
But yes, you are connecting the dots correctly. If those decisions had not been made around those trickle-down tax cuts, then that money could have been invested productively in our education system, in our healthcare system, in our infrastructure, and we wouldn't be relying on, the government now talking about user pays charges. And probably public-private partnerships, which we all know are going to cost us more in the long run anyway. And I think this is what really, really struck me, especially around the rhetoric that we heard from the Minister of Finance and from the Prime Minister today, is, guys, they are gearing the country up for privatisation. And this is the playbook of austerity. What happens is right-wing governments come in, they starve public infrastructure and they cut back on public spending. Then they blame those public programs for failing to deliver because they've been set up to fail to deliver because they're not being adequately funded. And then they argue to privatise those things, which take those costs off of the government books, but massively increase the costs for everyday New Zealanders. We've seen it, time and time again, that the Nats have been in charge. So it's unfortunately
you missed a step though, because normally what happens is when they're in opposition, they tell you government doesn't work, and then they get in and they break government, and then so that's the thing. It's like, and then when they break government, they step back and they go, "See, we always told you it doesn't work." When it's them that's broken it. So there's that element of fulfilling that narrative from opposition as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, this is just also where it just, as somebody who's very, very earnest and very, very nerdy and really tries to see good faith in the other arguments that are kind of presented in the public and the political spectrum, just for sake of trying to engage meaningfully on the arguments that are being put forward. The government is telling New Zealanders, look, it literally says in Nicola Willis's budget policy statement, the top priority here is to build a stronger, more productive economy that lifts real incomes and increases opportunities for New Zealand. Do you know what else was released today? News from another Crown Minister that the minimum wage is only going to go up by 1.5%, which is lower than the projected rate of inflation. It is the lowest increase to the minimum wage in 25 years, I think, and pretty much my entire lifetime. Then you have this point around a more productive economy. Productivity is premised upon public investment in the infrastructure that all of us rely on, and investment in the likes of education. This government is making a real noise about the fact that it's cutting back on humanities investment in humanities education in particular, but also on a number of other programs that are out there. But also, we have it on the record from Treasury and the Reserve Bank of New Zealand at Finance and Expenditure Select Committee hearings, where I've directly asked them over the last few years, what is the most productive form, or could we have a more productive tax system? And they have been crystal clear that if we were to baseline implement a capital gains tax, then we could start to end the state-sanctioned casino that is our housing market, and start to maybe begin to treat that like the human right that we've always said that it actually is and signed up to international conventions upon, and then start to see some of that investment, that capital, go into the productive economy that actually employs people. But no, what is the first thing that this government did in its mini budget at the end of last year and moving into the May budget in 2024? It did those trickle-down landlord tax cuts of $2.9 billion. Make it make sense, guys.
Well, Chewie's the one to make it make sense around housing, because that's been his bag for a long time about non-productive investment. Chewie, hey, off you go, sir.
Everything hinges on housing. Everything. Everybody's ignored it. Pat, you mentioned a figure. It was a big multi-billion-dollar figure. What was the figure?
It depends what we're talking about. 14 billion in tax cuts, 13 billion in the whole, 3 billion in landlords.
Okay, so I did some scratch math while you were talking, and I wasn't paying attention. So they've got all these billions of dollars that they're just gone now. 3 billion for the Otago Hospital, 3 billion for ferries, 3 billion for housing, 3 billion for nurses, 3 billion for teachers, 3 billion on Nelson and East Coast hospitals. That gets us to $18 billion. Isn't that pretty much our wish list?
Well, but they're only taking 17 billion in, Chewie, so it's never going to work. They're out by $1 billion, so they might as well do none of it. I mean, come on, if you can't do it all, you might as well do none of it.
I didn't study English, so I don't know numbers.
Hey, Nicola Willis did. She studied English. That's her qualifications. That's another conversation I've been having on Twitter today that we'll get to later. Sorry.
There has been so much discussion. Like, I know we have talked and others have talked about capital gains tax, and it was always the big boogeyman of the room, and everyone's coming for your investment portfolio, and you'll die cold and alone and destitute with nothing if Labor brings it in, or if anybody touches it. And we must have, if we're even going to consider it, there's got to be all of these caveats and carve-outs, and we've got to have a different name for it and all of this sort of stuff. Do you think all of this discussion and this very focused talk about it now with National at the wheel and just seeing what they're doing, do you think this is going to put people closer to accepting that this is what we need to do? Because we've been bouncing this ball off the wall for a long time.
Yeah, we have been. There's a number of layers to unpack in that. The first thing that I would say is that the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the OECD, two institutions that are not particularly well renowned at all for being progressive, but actually quite orthodox and relatively right-wing in their economic positioning, have recently made statements, including in their missions to Aotearoa, where they have pointed out that as a result of us not having a capital gains tax, stamp duty, inheritance tax, or anything along of that ilk of wealth tax or otherwise, that we are an outlier internationally, and particularly amongst those OECD countries, for not having a form of taxation that is intentionally going about redistributing. And it comes at the expense of productivity. So I think, firstly, we're not having a rational debate or discussion about tax at all in this country. I do think as well, and look, I'll be pretty explicit about it because obviously, I'm in the Greens for a reason. I've got, some pretty strong views, and I'll happily debate them with absolutely anybody. I've been trying to get Christopher Luxon to do an economics debate with me for a long time now. So if you guys want to host it, if Prime Minister Luxon would be keen to come on PHU.
He doesn't answer our emails, Chloe. I'm sorry to say. He and David Seymour and Nicola Willis, none of them answer our emails. But just so you know.
Yeah. But we have seen that, unfortunately, the last time that we had Labor at the helm, that they refused to implement a capital gains tax as well. And obviously they laid that at the feet of the Right Honourable Winston Peters. But I think the political calculus has unfortunately been such that we haven't forced this issue. So what I am hoping is that in the next 2 years, as we get to election 2026, that election 2026 is going to be the tax election. It has to be the tax election. If we go back to those figures that I was pointing to before from that High Wealth Individuals report from the IRD, the wealthiest people in this country pay an effective tax rate less than half of that of the average person. That means that the multi-millionaires are paying half the effective tax rate of our nurses and our teachers and you and me and the public servants who are on the front line of helping and assisting people, right? That is so deeply and profoundly unfair. But as you guys rightly point out, we have unfortunately been in this situation where tax has been treated as this bogeyman. But what we're in fact seeing is that as a result of the austerity approach that the current government is taking and the layoffs that have been occurring as a result, that the government's tax take that it needed in order to make its books balance are lower than expected because income tax projections and GST projections weren't met with reality. Reality was lower than what those projections were. So this is the thing about even the right-wing orthodoxy and the way that their kind of economic modelling works, is that they also rely on taxation. Taxation makes this country go around. It builds the public infrastructure, or we rely on debt, or we rely on public-private partnerships, which increase the cost of that in the long run for all of us anyway. So let's just have a straight up and honest conversation about it.
It's that idea that if we want to have the privileges or the resources of a Scandinavian country, we sort of need to pay the taxes that the Scandinavian countries do. But for some reason, some people think that we can pay the taxes of the US, but want the benefits of those Norways and Swedens and stuff, and the two don't go together.
Well, I think you're raising a really important point there, Pat, which is that, to just be oversimplified in all of this, we are basically, as a country, faced with the option of whether we want to become more like the United States of America, where it costs thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars to go to the hospital to be treated for, an emergency, or to have a baby. Or we could go down the track of those European countries and we could implement a fairer tax system whereby we invest in the public infrastructure that all of us rely on, and in turn actually create a more productive environment which employs people, develops more skills, and keeps people in this country. Yet in lieu of that, what we're seeing, and going more down that American track of things, is that young people are leaving this country in hordes.
Yep, absolutely. We do want to use this chat because, Chloe, second year in a row, we should have some kind of medal or something. The fan fave, one of the fan faves has come up, so well done.
We should get a sash.
Yeah.
Even better if it's on a sash.
In the colour of the party we're talking to. So we do want to reflect on the year as well. And I think I've seen you be interviewed recently, or at least a clip on maybe One News, that you yourself acknowledged for the Greens it's been a bit of a tough old year from time to time. What do you make of it?
Yeah, I mean, I feel honestly like I've been a bit of a broken record, but I truly mean it. I mean, you know, the weird thing about this job is that you're confronted with a bajillion cameras every other day, and people will kind of, you know, throw a million questions at you, which on your worst days kind of sound like a million different iterations of why do you suck so much? And all I've kind of had to say to those journalists is, you know, the reality is we've been confronted with the situations that we've been confronted with. Of course, this is not the hand that I would have chosen to have been dealt, but it has been dealt, and we've got to deal with it. And I think that hopefully, and this is what definitely helped, you know, as we worked through that process, is when people can see in the fullness of time that we did absolutely everything that we could in line with our values. And yeah, that I rest my head at night knowing that we did the best that we could. And that's that, really.
looking forward to where to from here. There was a point, I don't know if we were talking to you or another Green member, or maybe just me and Chewie were talking about, is there a future that you can see where the Greens are the dominant party on the left, like Labour is the little brother? Is that a realistic view for you guys, or is it always a support role?
I do see that as a more than realistic potential into the future, and something that, you know, is part of the reason that I'm in the Green Party. You know, you don't get into the Greens because you want to be in power for power's sake. You get into the Greens because you want to fundamentally redistribute power. So when I think about how we go about achieving the things that we aspire to achieve, and something else which does actually need to be shouted out is we did put out Kia ora Anamata, which is our emissions reduction plan, standing in stark contrast to the government's terrifying so-called emissions reduction plan. Our one reduces emissions more than 5 times what theirs does, and proposes a green jobs guarantee and a range of other things which would also improve people's lives. But I think it's vision documents like that, manifestos and policies which will demonstrably improve people's lives and improve the outcomes for the planet that we all share in common, which showcase, I guess, a better world that we could live in. And how we get there is by building political power to actually implement these things. So I think that there's an interesting parallel here to the conversation that we were just having about the political inertia that we've experienced and the turn taking between the legacy parties of Labour and National, as they're both, you know, over the past few decades led governments by just deciding that this is the Overton window of what they deem to be politically possible. That Overton window needs to be smashed because it is not serving us, and it has not served us for more than 40 years. And I think the unfortunate reality is a lot of people rightfully got excited about and on board with the idea of transformation 6 or 7 years ago now, and unfortunately saw that we were delivered tinkering. And I think for a number of people, especially communities that I directly engage with, that is so deeply disheartening and has eroded for many faith and trust that transformation is even plausible. And that's the work that we have to do, is to remind people that, you know, this stuff doesn't happen by itself. No one is coming to save us. And in order for us to transform this political system, this thing that we call an economy, which is literally just all of us and the rules that we put in place in order to govern the kind of outcomes that we want, well, regular people need to not leave politics to the politicians, because we'll get what we've always got.
Yeah. I think as well, just from a logistics point of view, if you're going to have a rough year, it's pretty good to have it in the first year of the cycle rather than the third, eh? You know what I'm saying?
I've got to say, yeah, while we've been dealing with things, I think that we've also managed to land a few big hits, while also, you know, really spending the time to properly articulate what an alternative could look like. Because that's definitely something that I hear from people out there across the country, is a frustration that politicians can get so sucked into the day-to-day tit for tat that they don't raise their head above it and go, hey guys, here's actually the plan, here's the reason that we can all be excited. And I actually saw that represented. I've been doing a fun little experiment since I became co-leader, and have been invited to address all of these big audiences, especially union audiences. We're at a few different union conferences throughout this year. I've stood up in rooms of, 300, 400, 500 people and asked people, just off the cuff, who here is excited about the future? And guys, it's so depressing. In each of those rooms, you know, fewer than half a dozen people or so put their hands up. And I think that that is precisely this government's strategy, part and parcel of moving ahead with so much awfulness at such pace. It is intended to disenfranchise and to disenchant people and to switch people off. But the more people that switch off, the more power that is handed to those who want to have that power and that privilege to continue orienting themselves in the direction that they are. So the only way that we are going to turn this ship around is if regular people continue to engage with politics. And that's what I want to mahi to you guys for what you've been doing and providing this platform and this space and sharing this information with people, because it is so, so critical that people understand what's going on out there.
Yeah, I think so. Chewie, sir, jump in.
I just want to say, I think the green tax policy from the last election was brilliant and didn't nearly get enough play in the media. And I think the messaging around that of like, we are going after the wealthy tax dodgers, not Daryl, who's got enough money from his tradie job to buy a boat, is going to be so key to next year. Because I think so many people in that category thought that National was going to print them a check, and it hasn't worked out. And exactly as you said, they've noticed their childcare costs go up. They've noticed, you know, especially for their tradies, their work dry up, their apprentices disappear, their groceries are still expensive, their mortgages are still expensive. And that just leads to really jaded people.
Yeah.
And I think if you can turn around and go, hey, look, all of these things that we want, you know, Otago, Nelson hospitals, all of these things that directly affect you, we can fix, is the drum to be banging. And it brings to mind a wee questionnaire went out for the local council down here that was basically a lead into going, you guys want less rates, don't you? And the overwhelming response they got back was, no, we want value out of the money that we give you. And I think that's a turning point for people, that it's not just a race to the bottom. We can have the nice things as well. It's just people need to do some heavy lifting. Yeah,
well, we do have enough. We actually do have enough. But what we're seeing is the extremities of inequality. 311 households hold more wealth than the bottom 2.5 million New Zealanders. I'll give you another stat. We actually don't have good data on who owns all of the properties in this country, because I really pushed for it, including under the last Labour-led government, but unfortunately wasn't able to get traction there. And of course, it was completely dumped as an idea when the Nats came to power. But I was looking for there to be a landlord register so that we actually understood how many landlords there are in the country. But right now, the best that we can kind of determine is looking at Companies Office data, Land Information New Zealand, and a range of other sources, bond lodgement data from MB. That tells us that we have approximately 120,000 landlords in this country, but we have more than 10 times that, more than 11 times that in the form of renters. We have 1.5 million renters in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Yet if you look at the way that public policy is set, it's very heavily skewed in the direction of the landlord. So again, we are just not seeing people understand currently at scale where power actually sits in raw numbers alone, because that's the other point of this, is that politics belongs to those who turn up. And right now, we know, particularly if you're talking, Chewie, about local body elections, that voter turnout is around 30%, 30 to 40% in any given area of the country. And that is disproportionately people who already own a property and have probably been there for a long time and are disproportionately older. That is in no way, shape or form anything antagonistic towards people who fit that demographic. But what we do know is that that demographic does tend to skew more conservative. And again, I actually think there's some interesting data that's starting to come out of generations like millennials, which shows that in fact they are not getting more conservative with age. But if you look at the general and typical trajectory of somebody's life, and again, this is massively oversimplified, but it makes a lot of sense. when you are younger, you tend to potentially have a more exploratory view of things. You're going, what is this world? How do these systems work? What's my place in this? Is this fair and is this just? And as you get older, the system requires you to participate in it and effectively then be somebody who has a stake in it, especially if you come to own a property or otherwise. And then you think about all of that rhetoric that you were talking about just before, Chewie, with regard to taxation or otherwise. And as you get older, you maybe own some stuff, you start to have a family, and that view, that perspective, potentially, again, oversimplified, but potentially narrows a little bit. And people understandably are thinking about the day-to-day and how they just survive. And you can come to understand how when a politician says, hey, I'm going to give you a tax cut and put more money in your back pocket tomorrow, not, hey, I'm going to do a 10-year infrastructure plan and figure out how we're going to tax the multi-millionaires to pay for it. And in 10 years' time, the country's going to be massively different and far more prosperous. Those are quite difficult things, understandably, for people to compute. Because when you're struggling on a day-to-day, unfortunately, the austerity trickle-down economics that right-wing politicians are selling sound attractive, but again, in reality, they just don't stack up.
Yeah. We're going to wrap up shortly. I want to ask you a couple of quick questions. Each of these questions I realise could be 20-minute answers. That's on you.
I'll be as short as I can, guys.
While I'm asking these two questions, Chewie, do you want to check the chat for any questions? Remember, we tell people thanks for the chats, thanks for the super chats. There's no guarantee your question will get asked, even if you've done one. But here's one I want to put up first, Chloe. This is from Mama Mac. Thank you for the super chat. Was talking to a boomer, lifelong Labor supporter at my dad's 80th birthday earlier this year that voted Green for the first time because she thought Chloe would build the best world for her grandchildren. So that's a pretty cool chat there.
Far too Mickey. Shout out. Thank you so much for sharing that. It's very affirming. I guess, as you can all assume, as politicians, we get a lot of hate. So it's nice to get affirmation. But if I can just point something out in that feedback, I do get so wary. It's very, very kind, but I get so wary when people put me on a pedestal, because I think that that's where unintentionally we can buy into some of the individualization that the right really want us to buy into. So we need each other, whānau. That's the key message from me. If anything, we need each other.
The kind of last two questions, sort of there's three questions here, but because I think it's really important we don't let it go and let it go away. And as I said, we could talk about this for an hour now, but what do we need to know? What do we need to be thinking about when we're looking at places like Gaza today?
What we need to know is that we are currently having a genocide live streamed on our cellular devices, and world leaders, so-called world leaders, are refusing to act. And that is, words fail me. Honestly, words fail me. Because we had spent, a year trying to get this government to act, and we thought that, potentially the likes of the findings and the outcomes from the ICJ and the ICC, the requesting, an arrest warrant for Benjamin Netanyahu, and findings of plausible genocide, let alone all of the reports from NGOs internationally over the last not only few years but few decades. That should be enough to compel so-called leaders to act, but evidently it is not. We've been pushing this government to act for the last year, and they have refused to do so. So as of a week ago, I put an Israel sanctions bill into the biscuit tin. What's important for people to know about that is that if we get 61 non-executive members to sign on to support that legislation, then it bypasses the biscuit tin and gets onto the floor of the House. We had unequivocal support from Te Pāti Māori from day one. So with the Greens and Te Pāti Māori, that's 15 MPs from the Greens, 6 from Te Pāti Māori, that's 21. We are hoping to, I actually haven't checked in with Labour as to what happened in their caucus today, because there's been a few things happening with HYEFU. But given the statements that Labour has made, obviously really hoping that they come on board with that as well. That means that we need just 5 or 6 MPs from the government to use their conscience and to support this bill. We don't need Christopher Luxon anymore. We don't need Winston Peters anymore. And we definitely don't need that other guy. We just need politicians to use their moral compass. And I've asked the Prime Minister directly in question time a week or two ago if he would allow his MPs to use their consciences. Pretty to character and to type. Unfortunately, he kind of refused to answer. But I think that that's something, if people who are concerned about this very literal genocide, that's something that people can do over the holidays, is contact their local National MP or even their local New Zealand First MP. I don't know if the other party's worth any of our time.
I noticed how you said "and the other guy" because he's like Voldemort. You're not allowed to say his name. Is that the vibe?
Well, he loves a platform, guys. I think it's that's what I've really struggled with, as I think a lot of people in progressive political circles have this year, is, you know, if you think about something like the Treaty Principles Bill, if you think about all of the divisive and awful stuff that is happening, they are very clearly playing a strategy called constructive polarization. They are not aiming for half of the electorate. They don't care about half of the country. What they want is 10 to 15%, and they will get it by any means necessary.
Yeah.
And what I've been really heartened by is that despite their best attempts to divide us, I have not seen the country more unified in my entire lifetime. The people united, we will win.